Next person.
Sure.
I'm so sorry. I meant to say that this conversation will be recorded. So sorry about that, Claudia. Back to you.
That's fine. Thank you, Taisha. So I am Claudia Erasme, and I'm an urban designer and urban strategist. And I am originally from the Dominican Republic. And I moved to New York to come to grad school. And I absolutely fell in love with New York. It is now my hometown. That was over 20 years ago that I came. And professionally, I am the former managing deputy commissioner for the Department of Design and Development in Chicago. And before that, I was the chief urban designer here at the Department of City Planning in New York. I am currently wrapping up a much needed sabbatical after almost 20 years of public service. And so thank you, Co-Census, for helping me kind of make this transition back into the arena, and for having me today. So I'll pass it on to Juan.
Thanks, Claudia, and hi, everyone. My name is Juan. I'm originally from Bogotá in Colombia, and I've been in New York for about 5 years. I moved over here after almost 5 years as well, working over there in urban development at different scales, local scales, regional scales, national scales. And yeah, I came over here to work with different companies all surrounded urban development and how can we make cities better? How can we create impact through design, through work with local agents? How can we actually trigger plans to become a reality? And I'm currently transitioning to a more impact finance related role, but always carrying in my heart the urban planner that I've been since I graduated. And so this is a great space and I'm really excited to talk to you all. And yeah, please, Jose, introduce yourself.
Thank you for that, Juan. I'm super excited to be in conversation with all of you. My name is Jose Richard Aviles. Born and raised in South Central Los Angeles. I still live home in South Central. I choose not to leave the hood because the hood raised me, so I don't believe in leaving the hood. I have a master's in social work and a master's in urban planning, so a lot of my work is really about the intersections of those two things. I joke that I live a double life. During the day, I work for the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. There, I primarily focus on equity and transportation planning. And I feel like I stumbled into transportation planning because of lived experience. I grew up on the bus. All of my organizing background comes with the Bus Riders Union in Los Angeles. So little did I know at 15 and 16 that I was a planner. And it wasn't until grad school that I discovered that. And then during my nightlife, I guess, I am an artist. I'm a performing artist, which is why now I'm in Seattle. I'm out here working and shooting a couple of folks for a project that I'm working on called Papi Issues, which is a zine that looks at my relationship as a queer person to masculinity and, of course, the daddy issues that it comes with. And yeah, so I do a little multiple of those things. And I joke and laugh that, you know, during the day, I get to put out an RFP, a request for proposals. And then at night, I get to put out an RFD, a request for daddies. And it all makes sense in my head. And it's great. Yeah, I'm slowly trying to make the transition, I think, while we're having this conversation around transitioning more to arts and culture planning. I think for the longest, I worked so hard to compartmentalize my role as an artist and my role as an urban planner. But true, I'm finding that as an urban planner, I'm not interested in infrastructure, but rather I'm interested in restoring the sacred relationship between body and earth. And I'm finding that arts and cultural strategy is the best way to do that. So I'm slowly hoping where my day job is also art related, so I can say I'm a full-time artist.
Yes. Y'all, thank you so much for those introductions. I'm just going to give everyone a little bit of a warning. I'm going to be unmuted, so you're going to hear a lot of because in my culture, the call and response, that's how we recognize, like, yes, I see you, I hear you, I feel it. I want to kick us off, and it's funny because we were all in a meeting, I want to say last week or the week before, and I was like, I want to start the conversation off spicy because we love challenging the status quo. We love being like, well, how do we break the norms that we're presently stuck in? So one of the norms across the design field is universal design. I want to open up with a big question of, is design universal? Can it even be something that is universal? And I ask that question because, Jose, so much of what you said about arts, cultural responsiveness really resonated with me. So maybe I can start with you. Is design universal, or can it even be something that is universal?
I want to say that in its essence, yes. I feel like we're constantly in conversation with designing, especially from the politic and the ethic of a queer body. I mean, everything that I do, I may have not chosen my sexuality, but I do choose my politics. And I choose to be Jota, and I choose to, okay, funny story. Y'all, definitely one thing you should know about me is that I got stories. So of course, in papi issues, there's a lot of play and eroticism and desirability. I think some of those questions can also be translated to our work in urban planning, but not gonna lie, y'all. Tell me why on Monday. Well, I don't know if you can see them now, but I don't think so. But I showed up with like two big old hickeys to a meeting, and I had folks that were like, "Oh my God, girl, aren't you concerned?" I was like, "No, my work speaks for itself." So yeah, know that I'm about to show up in everything that I am, right? And everything that I do. I believe that professionalism is a construct of white supremacy. So I'm always cursing in meetings. But I think to answer your question, in its essence, I think design truly is something universal. The question then is based on whose standards are we designing? Because design involves aesthetics, and aesthetics is a social construct. So one can then deduce that design is also a social construct. And so we are just constantly asking ourselves, who is the designer and whom are we designing for? I think that in regular planning processes, we're taught that we should design to for the client, and the client is 9 out of 10 times never the user. So I'm like, why am I designing for you if you're not going to sort of like take in the consequences of my design?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I also just, I'm going to pass it to Claudia, but I just want to say, you said social construct and deduce in the same sentence. So the sociologist in me just hugs everything you did all the way across on the West Coast. Claudia, universal design, social construct, real, not real. Yeah.
So I think that there are parts, or the essence, as Jose said, of design is universal in the sense that this is why we're here. Almost is like that expression of and creation of space, and what we do in space, how we look at space. I think that there's very important for us as human beings that we experience surprise, awe. I mean, this is what nature provokes in us, right? I think that a lot of what we go out and experience in the wilderness, for those of us that grew up in urban environments, it's sort of like a learned thing, right? But for people that grew up more connected to nature, there's a design that is embedded in how nature works. And I think that it elicits a lot of emotions. I went to a trail in Hawaii about 10 years ago, and after hiking up next to the river, I encountered this like forest of bamboos. And I almost walked back because it was so intimidating. And, it totally took me by surprise. It really reached my soul in a way that I had to stop and kind of like consciously take it in, take the sound, take the breeze, take the light and how it was coming through. So I think that those parts of design are definitely universal. And I think that what we're trying to do as planners and urban designers in terms of our built environment is, and I think this is a big part of what might make social impact, right? It's how do we bring these things into our cities, into our everyday lives? Because I don't think that our health depends on our access to that kind of stuff. Mental, social, spiritual health. And so I think that is the big challenge, right? Like, we don't want to live in the forest. It's not about that. But I think that there's aspects of those experiences in terms of what it creates in us, that it's part of what we want to bring to the cities.
Absolutely. And Juan, last but not least, what are your thoughts on this?
I resonate a lot with what Claudia and Jose Richard had said. I think that design is universal, but not necessarily by design. It just opens itself to be universal by two ways. And it's how do people interact with space and how interacting with that space, they're ever changing what the space means. And so I think those two processes that are complementary and that are happening fast and we can actually anticipate it, create spaces to be universal. So everyone can be a part of it, or actually, but not being a part of it, they're also changing that design and the focus of the space. So I do think that it's universal in that sense, and everyone could be part of a design of a space. And that's what's interesting about, public space. And it's, we all get to be a part of it.
Yeah, I love that you also said, even by not being a part of it, that says something. Like there's so much about design interacting or not interacting with it that is incredibly meaningful. For the audience, just so you know, we're going to break down the topics that we're getting into. So we just talked about design and what that could be. What I want to break down next is the social impact part. How do y'all define social impact from the lens of the public sector, urban design, or even like community-centered design? What does that mean when it relates to social impact? And anyone can kick us off with an answer for that.
I can start. So, social impact is it's so big, right? It can be so big because I think it's everything that has to do with how, from an urban design perspective, how space impacts our self, our well-being, and well-being, including what I was saying about the environment, about the size, the ability to see and exchange with other people. We are social beings. We, even introverts, need to have community, right? And so I think that part of what social impact is in urban settings, in creating public spaces in urban settings, it's about thinking through really what the spaces are meant to deliver. Because even in the same city, you need a multiplicity of spaces, but also some of our spaces like Central Park, Prospect Park, they're like huge. They call in, regional users to this space. And part of that attractiveness is precisely that you can do a multiplicity of activities in them. And on the other hand, you have more of like even, your street space, your most basic public space that sometimes or most times it's more of a transit or mobility use. However, we all know, when I moved to New York, a month after walking the streets of New York, I sat down at a curb because I was like, I can't walk anymore. Like, I'm not used to this. And so I think that those experiences is what starts to, for me as a designer, bring information, right? Like if I need to sit down, I am sure a lot of people need to sit down on the streets, right? Like if I need to, if shade is going to help me, like, and so, and that I'm kind of moving ahead. I think that, of the definition, but what to me social impact means is understanding place, understanding community, understanding actual needs, and understanding the purpose of a particular location. Also, not just for the current issues or current needs and communities, but also recognizing history, recognizing geography, recognizing natural resources. It's not a one size fits all, but I think that in a way, it's more of an attitude of really allowing a place to reveal to you what its potential, and that is addressing, different aspects of society.
I'll go next because Claudia said some things I think I want to build upon. Specifically on this idea of potential, I think a lot of the times for me within planning, we don't allow for entropy. or organized chaos. But truly, chaos lives in the natural design of things. I mean, we're constantly in tension and in conflict, right? It's what we do with conflict that is more important in how we mitigate and have conversations. So yes, I think about the potential of a space and also the lack of potential, because then people can fill in that potential. So to me, that's like an 80-20 design, right? Like, let me do all my designs to 80%, let folks take up how they're going to take up space. And then that 20% is only meant to amplify the way and the behavior already existent and natural, as opposed to what planning teaches us to be rigid or to colonize. Really, let's be real. Planning is a project of settler colonialism. To the definition of social impact, the organizer in me is going to say capacity building, community agency, and it's also going to say a shift to power. Like, listen, if none of your planning comes with a power analysis, then I'm not here for it, right? Like, don't get me started on a bunch of folks who do DEI work and have no idea what power mapping is, and it's like, girl, like the basics, right? Then the queer in me wants to say that it's self-determination and self-creation. I think one of the cool things about, not the cool things, but one of the blessings of being born queer in this lifetime and all lifetimes has been this notion that my queerness has been the thing that has changed the most in my life. I'm not the same queer when I first came out at 8 years old, but it's been the one constant thing in my life. So change is constant, right? And quoting Octavia Butler, love and goddess for all the queers. But truly, I think queerness does teach us that self-determination and self-actualization is very much okay, and it's part of the process, and it's totally fine to change and be okay with change. And I will also say, of course, I mean, I think at this point, y'all know that I have anecdotes, but the most efficient design I've ever seen is any sex club. Go to a sex club, and let me tell you that is the most efficient architecture I have ever seen. Every little nook has a little place for you to do. You know what you're going to do in these places. This is for this is for that. And if it's not for that, you can make it that place as well. So it's a lot of like play literally and figuratively. So I've always been fascinated by sex clubs, and be like, I want to meet the architects of these clubs because y'all are doing better than a lot of everybody else. The last thing I'll share, no, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I also would like to build upon what they both said, and it's a lot of change. And I think defining social impact is an ever-changing task. Like, it's the question that we ask ourselves. I've asked that question for the last 2 years of my graduate program, and I've seen it in so many ways play out. And when I bring it to urban planning or to, space as a general context, it changes. And I think it translates the conversation to something that Jose Richard was saying, and it's that ever-changing circle or cycle. And then I think the place of the conversation is more related to what's the means to that end of impact. And so to go to that end, you need to understand, what do you want to be impactful for or at, or to whom? And then you can start, like, do the backing process of what is it that you're actually going to be proposing? What are the structures that you think you're going to be able to enable that impact to take place? Because impact happens every single day, negative, positive, planned, unplanned. And I think that's something that is really beautiful of what Jose Richa said, is working within formal developments. You see the maximization of space, of uses, of, social agreements of who can use a park, say, in the morning, in the night, in the afternoon, with kids, without kids. And the structures tend to build themselves without having to have a planner, without having to have an official that's actually dictating what the impact would be. And so I feel like that entropy or that just unplanned space use is very significant to that idea of impact when we're thinking about who are we wanting to impact, when do we want to create this impact, how are we going to make it sustainable, and how is it going to evolve throughout time. So it's more of a measurement rather than a tool that you bring to a table and this is my tool set for impact. I think that's something that I mean, probably won't get you that far.
Yeah, there's one key thread that I have heard through what all three of y'all have said, and it's really about the people and the community at hand, right? Like there's so many ways we, or as planners, you're focused on like, what does the client want? Or you're focused on like efficiency and being rigid, but really like designing for people, or excuse me, I should say with people instead of for, but like designing and understanding like people's needs. And then that 20%, right, that entropy you kind of talked about is like really about the social structures and like all the unseen things that happen within a community related to culture, social agreements that are there that, you know, if you're a planner coming from it externally, you don't live in that community, you're just not going to see it, and you're not going to even know it unless you've lived there. So those are kind of the threads. I want to ask one more question that's really related to how we frame what we're talking about here, and it's about history. So much about planning is for the future. How does history play a role in public spaces, especially when you're thinking about social impact?
I'll try to answer that one first, just 'cause that's all I'm doing right now. But so one of the contracts that I'm working on right now is on radical imagination for racial justice. And as we're thinking about the word radical, and particularly, a lot of the conversation has been around, you know, the connotations we associate with the word radical. But what we forget is that the etymology of the word radical is root. So you got to go back to the root. And so much of history really, as I was talking earlier about a power analysis, usually when we engage in power analysis, we'll differentiate the different types of power, right? When we talk about oppression, we commonly are referring to the power over. Somebody has the power over X policy, over people, whatever it be. Then there's the power to, right? That is sort of the agency that we have within ourselves. That's all that internal healing work, that transformational work. Then we have the power with, which is about the power that we have in numbers. This is coalition building. This is campaign work. This is organizing. But one of the powers that I feel like I coined, and I'm just throw it out there because whatever, is the power from. Knowing who you come from, it is so powerful. And so for me, I think recently in my own personal life, that has meant going back to, which happened to us last week. I just jumped into a meeting and I was in Mexico, the town where my mom grew up, and now I got to know all these. I had heard all these names, but had never placed any geographical location to them. And to live it for a week, I was like, oh, I get this. And how did you migrate from this town to this town? It just opened up so much inquiry. And I think the power from is super important. I think in my own spiritual practice, it's been a lot about honoring ancestors and really honoring the fact that there have been social structures and social systems that we can, you know, learn from and change and say, you know what, these systems were meant for me in the first place. So fuck you in the system. I believe that all social impact lives outside of the institution. And folks know that. People, I'm always very vocal about, like, I'm not committed to institutions, I'm committed to people. And so I think going back to your question of history, being able to highlight stories that we don't often hear about, because I think, especially particularly as people of color, the one reference that I can think of is the unity clap, which has been known as sort of like a clap that unified a lot of the farm workers during Cesar Chavez movement and Brown movement. But what a lot of people forget to mention, it's the ending of that clap ends with Itzan Batzan, which is Tagalog, you come for one, you come for all. And it was a way that Filipino workers and Chicano workers were meeting each other. And rather than talking about the stories of coalition building, we don't hear that story often. And so it's thinking about those moments, and that there have been moments where there have been coalition among marginalized groups, and that there is an opportunity for us to then find new coalitions and find new ways to organize. I think that's super important. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Gems drop. Thank you. Claudia, you look like you're thinking, like this is moving and you got words that are coming together. What's on your
Well, so listening to Jose, I couldn't help thinking about my stint in Chicago. I was there for a year and a half. I arrived in a, you know, high, like a leadership role in a city that I hardly knew, and I'm just like, I'm drinking everything that Jose is saying, because it is so true. And for example, part of my challenge there was to really understand there's a lot of status quo going on in terms of how the conversations are had, what assumptions you bring to the table, what assumptions you don't bring to the table, what you express and how you express it. There's like code, basically. And coming from somewhere else, it was fascinating to me and challenging to constantly be the one person saying, but why, but why, but why? Or where does that come from? And what is the history behind that? So I think Jose Richard took me to the more of the social history and how that affects how we even perceive space, how we perceive each other, how we perceive where we belong and don't belong. And that was certainly a big part of my experience in Chicago, where part of what I feel New York has and part of what I fell in love with in terms of like having another reference, not comparing, was more of like, and I was younger, obviously, and didn't come here in a position of leadership or, I came here to go to grad school. It was more of that, my sense of coming from Santo Domingo, which is a much smaller city, to this big city where anything is possible. And that was very palpable when I arrived here in 1999. And it was sort of like that idea of, oh, I can make it here too. Like I could belong to this place. And I think that part of it is personally relating and experiencing possibility in the public spaces that I was able to go, right, or to be a part of. And so in that way, I would say this is part of why I have dedicated myself to thinking about public space, because it is fascinating to me how little things, it's not even about the aesthetic side is important for sure, but I think it's really about the details. And the details matter so much because a lot of my practice here, for example, at city planning was in New York, was in Chicago, really. It's the dimensions. Like, how do you feel in like a super narrow sidewalk versus a wider sidewalk? How do you feel in a narrow path versus a wide path? How do you feel when the city is sort of like kicking you out of your, you can't really be comfortable? I always say public space is like your living room. You have sectionals and chairs that you can really relax on, or you have a very stiff chair that makes you want to stand up 5 minutes later. And so it's really about thinking about all of this and how all of this plays a part in making a space attractive. Now, going back to the history part, I think that just as there's the social history, but I think that I really appreciate art in public spaces, and Chicago was amazing at that, actually. There's so much expression of identity and diversity in terms of murals and how do you integrate art into buildings and facades and that kind of stuff, that I think is something that there's a lot more to explore. How do we recognize and see ourselves through expressions of art and learn about our history through the spaces that we inhabit? So sorry, I took you all over the place, but
Oh, no, you hit some really good milestones along the way. So I think there's some of that we can jump into shortly. But Juan, I want to get your perspective on this too, like history, especially in urban design, like what role?
Yeah, I feel like the first idea that came to my mind listening to the question was the Séptima Peatonal. For those of you who have been in Bogota, the Séptima is the most important, the royal street of Bogota. It has meant it carries a tremendous amount of history, not only in terms of the building of the city, the creation of the city, the expansion of the city, but politically, socially, it has meant a lot for the people. And so I fell in love with the Séptima when I was growing up, understanding Bogota. And I was able to live in a specific moment in which it turned from a road, like a traditional commerce road, to a pedestrian street. And that brought hell. Like, good things, bad things, regular things, people started fighting. And all of that to say, I feel like after a couple of years of the measurement being implemented and, had its ups and downs, and some things were great, some things were lacking, I think one of the most important lessons, just discussing the people, partners, and different clients that you would take and show them what the city would have done, was you need to be able to understand where you're working on the context, the history of a place. But I think I want to double down in the concept of how you plan it for the future, and how do you break those kinds of rules, relations that the past have built, but probably, I mean, it's more disruptive and more interesting to create those new spaces, to understand those kinds of new realities that could take place into this sort of public space or new spaces. And so thinking about having, I don't know, a juggler festival and fire eating people and everyone dancing salsa at 10:30 at night, drinking guarapo in the space that, the local politicians of the 1940s were proclaiming status of what the government should be like. Well, that's super exciting. And it's when you start thinking like how the space transforms itself and carries meaning throughout, the history, and especially to the new spaces of culture. So I do think that when we look into history, and especially like in public space, it matters a lot where it comes from, but I would like to double down into what it would mean for the future, and how can we make this space meaningful for the people that are going to come, for the people that are here right now, that we make it more inclusive, that we make it, accessible, affordable, sustainable, and all the ables that we talk about every day, but that, I don't know, we tend to talk about them a lot, but not actually do things for them. And so, yeah, I think that vision of the future is where the history brings you.
Yeah, a lot of what all three of y'all said very much reminded me of the framework of trauma-informed design, right? Like, how do you make spaces that bring people joy instead of asking like the general rigid questions about the space and practicality and function, but like, what does joy look like in this space? What is like people's open culture and the responsiveness of their culture, so you can consider the future and the evolution even look like here? I just want to say to the audience that we have 20 minutes left. In about 10 minutes, I'm going to tap into some audience questions. If y'all are interested in asking questions to our panelists, please drop down to the bottom of your Zoom section and drop a question in Q&A. So please do that now so we can start getting some questions in. If not, I will keep going with a couple of more questions we have queued up. I want to get into the meat, into the, I hate to say like the practice of it all, because like sometimes a lot of this work can feel theoretical, but like as a planner, as a designer, when you start getting into the weeds of creating a space, a lot of folks like to think through, well, like, how does that actually work? Especially because I have like all this bureaucratic stuff that I'm navigating through. So can each of you share an example of a public space that you feel was designed with a lot of social impact in mind and how it positively served a community? And let's be mindful of the fact that we just, defined what social impact can mean in relation to space. But what is one space that really represents that to each of y'all based off of like how it's designed or planned?
I'll go. I have an example that just came straight away. Before I was at the Othering and Belonging Institute, I was at the LA Department of Transportation for Vision Zero. So I was working on the pedestrian safety. And I just remember particularly one time where there had been about 3 crashes in the span of a month on the same corridor. And the first thing that came to my mind was that that's a constant re-exposure to trauma, which is one of the criteria that we use to diagnose PTSD on people. And from there, I got to thinking of, well, how do I create a criteria to diagnose PTSD in the infrastructure? And so then that was a whole little project. But the cool thing that came out of that was my supervisor, Dr. Destiny de Guzman, founder of the Thrivance Group. I love Dr. Destiny. Was like, so what you gonna do about it? And I was like, I don't know. And so what it ended up actually happening is that we held a healing circle. And so I organized a bunch of city staff, DOT staff, and a bunch of the community, and we had a 3-hour restorative justice session on healing and just talking about what these crashes do to everyday life. And to this day, a couple of the engineers who attended that session say that that was the most impactful session that they went to. And I think for me in practice, why I say all that is particularly when it comes to equity work. First and foremost, I'm a social worker. And so I don't, I wrote an article for APA years ago called Planners as Therapists and Cities as Clients. And we're actually expanding that article to a longer memo that gets into some of the practice that can be used. And one of the things that I think I'm discovering now, especially in equity work, is that we don't take enough time to process the social emotional labor of doing equity. Like what happens when you're in an equity conversation and you're one of, right, the few handful of people of color who are having this conversation, and what that does to the body, and why there's this urgency behind the reason we're planners. And so in my practice with the clients that I work with, I create opportunities for us just to process. Like, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the fact that the mayor is saying yes and then throwing you underneath the bus. Let's talk about that. And I think one of the cool things that I discovered in my role as a technical assistance service provider has been the fact that I live in a weird limbo state of power. Like, I am not going to be in relationship with the state agencies longer than this contract, but the CBOs will. So I get to build a relationship with the CBOs and say, what are the things that you want to say that you can't say because of the politic? Because I can say them. And so I think advocacy is very, very important. We as planners have a lot of professional power. What would happen if we use this professional power to amplify community power? I still dream of the day that there's a sit-in, all planners and city staff at a city hall. Like, fuck this. Like, everyone is striking, y'all. I mean, like, I'm down.
I love that. Claudia, Juan, any thoughts in relation to that? Any spaces that come in mind?
Well, I'll go. A few things I wish I had the experience that Jose has had, to be totally honest, because I don't have that background, but also that's sort of what, to me personally, it's more attractive to try to get into the meat and of how people perceive space and what they want and how they experience it. That said, part of what I used to do in my job in New York City was really write regulations about public space. And so what we did, or what I did, is that we went out and talked to, like I did a lot of the waterfront regulations for privately owned public spaces. And so we would go and talk to the representatives of the community board and really try to understand some of their visions for the waterfront and understand some of the needs. And then we will take whatever regulations apply and kind of like push the boundary, or try to create regulations that could respond to those needs. Now, it's always a sticky place to be because we're not building those spaces. And so then the second part of the process is to actually sit down with the designers and the community members in some occasions to work through how do we get it to actually be designed and built in a way that is responsive and that is really going to maintain the type of impact that the community is hoping for. So, waterfronts to me are very close to my heart, because I think also that they're very special spaces for us as humans, and getting the opportunity to design spaces that get you down to the water and more in nature was something that it seems so natural, but it took a lot of effort to make it even possible in New York City. And that's part of what we did. So I worked in the most of the waterfront in Brooklyn and in Queens. And I would say to me, it's not necessarily, there was that social measurement of impact, although maybe Parks Department has it, but one of my favorite spaces, it's the second phase of the Hunters Point South waterfront park, because it, especially the section that takes you down to the water And then there's like an area that you can't even see until you're kind of like in it. You have to kind of go with the path. And I think that that really has a lot of the experiences that I was talking about at the beginning of discovery and surprise and kind of like finding yourself in areas that are not your typical experience in the city. And then kind of giving you another way of perceiving space.
Yeah, I think that one of the most surprising moments that helped me fall in love with public space was going to Philly, and I was walking to the Museum of Natural History from, I don't know, from Alt City or whatever. I really like walking, so I walked all the way, and what I found out was this placemaking activity, really low budget, and I had never seen that at all, ever. And I thought, this is amazing. This is a different city. Like crossing a street, and now I find people sitting down, enjoying, regardless of whatever, people in suits, people, just hanging out, kids, food trucks. This is what the city should be like, right? And I had never had that encounter. And so since then, I've looked for ways in which you can implement that. But I think that, well, one of the most important elements that you rarely find in regulations, mainly because it takes time and the investment to actually create a framework for that is costly, and you need to prioritize where you put your resources, personal and financial. But in a general sense, I would like to go back to what I said in the beginning, and it's, so how do people interact with space? And it's, there's an example that I love, and it's, think about when you go to a new hotel room and you open the door, and it's a foreign space. Once you sit down in the bed, you take off your shoes, you hang your coat, the space feels a little bit more yours. And therefore you start creating an experience of that, what that space means. You create value to the space, right? You feel appropriated to the space. If you find a roach in the middle of the night crawling, you probably are going to hate that room, right? And you'll never be there again. And that sort of identification and use of the space, measuring that, I think it's one of the biggest tasks that no one wants to think about, because it's so costly. It breaks any single political time frame that no one actually wants to, put the money towards that or be the first one to do so. And so that's where I think organizations that work in public space, that take into account the value of creating, space per se, have a lot of value in our planning. And, placemaking is one of the things that we could do as planners and as community leaders and as community. However, there's a lot more that relate to gender inclusivity, to identification of priorities of communities, for economic development, for better use of space, for transportation, for mobility. There's so many ways that we can start implementing those kinds of activities that, I feel that social impact refers to that. And it's a process that is lengthy. However, there's ways in which we can start creating those foundations.
Yeah. What I'm hearing from y'all is like, evaluation should be an ongoing part of the process, right? To like better understand like how the space is being utilized, but like how that evolves over time. I also heard a lot about that community, like bringing people together, not even when the space is designed. But Jose Richard, you talked about like that healing like space and like that restorative circle where we can actually have the space and capacity to just speak about the history of things. And then also because like a lot of this work is so tied up with regulations and bureaucracy, but like acknowledging that and understanding that there's power in the work that is being done, but power comes in many forms. So how do we even consider all those different forms, the power that you have as a planner and designer, the power that the community has, and how do you try to like coalesce all of those? Those are the things I'm hearing from what y'all are said, which all of those are fantastic. And I really hope people are taking notes and coming up with some ideas for their own implementation and for their own work. We have 8 minutes left, y'all. We got a couple of questions in the chat, but thankfully our questions are kind of similar. So I want to close out with one thing that I know bubbles up, and that is related to these questions. And it's, how do we get the community involved? I think there's a lot of there's a million different community engagement frameworks out there, and there's a million different ways people will identify community engagement. But generally, when you're working on a project, how do you bring in the community to the process? And how do you keep them engaged in that evaluation process moving forward? Any high level thoughts or gems anyone can drop on that for our audience?
I can start with one, which I'm not, just to put it out on the table, but and I wasn't necessarily super close to this initiative, but I know in Chicago there's an initiative called POPs. And I thought it was really interesting because it was about creating temporary activations around the city, and the government actually funding them through subsidies. And so the idea wasn't that the government was designing them. The idea wasn't that the government was putting them up. The idea was that government was giving you the money for you, community, group, to identify the space, identify your audience, and identify, what kind of uses you want to bring to that space. And these started about 2.5 years ago. I got to experience one of them built in Austin, in the neighborhood of Austin in West Chicago, and talk to the people that were behind them. And the notion in that particular strip, it was a commercial strip, of having these super bright color, kind of very attractive corner that kind of even the pavement sort of was painted up onto the street and took you, that color palette took you to the other side of the street, was really putting a stake on the ground and saying, this is different, this is us, this is for us. And hearing about the programming of that space, that it was by community, for community, about how that started to bring people out of their house and feel safer because there was this actual space to go to, as opposed to, meandering or having to go to a commercial space. I think it's a super interesting model where you're really empowering local people to, it's never going to be perfect. You can never have 100% buy-in. But I think that part of our challenge in a lot of our cities, it's even the notion of what can we even do here? Because if you don't have a reference, it's really hard to just come out with a big idea. I mean, some of us can, some other people can. I am a little bit more systematic, but what I mean is that sometimes you have more of a strike of genius, and you kind of imagine something happening in a place, and that can come from absolutely anyone. And so it's bringing that kind of creativity and making it work for everyone. But then you have to find sort of your co-creators, right? And I think that government in particular has a big role to play. And as a former public servant, I would say a lot of personal frustration, because sometimes you want to make it work, and you kind of feel, you're tight. So I think that mentioning the model, but also mentioning that there's a lot more work to do. And I think that this transcends even planning. I think that it's almost, we need our circle to really rethink even how we governance structures and what we really expect of government. Because as Juan mentioned before, political timelines have nothing to do with real time timelines. And that's a humongous issue, to actually choose to do the right thing.
Listen, Claudia and Juan are becoming my besties. I feel like we can do something really dope together. Let me just start off by saying that surveys is not it. Surveys is not it. Surveys should not be seen as an end all be all. I think of surveys as a jumping point. right? Like surveys let us know what sort of like give us an insight to the phenomenology or demographic of who's showing up and who's not showing up and how people are answering. That requires a power analysis. Surveys is like, okay, cute, let's go somewhere else. I really do believe that that's why planning is a cultural strategy, because it does not involve this really rigid scientific method. That's not to say that art isn't research. Art is definitely research. We as artists are researchers as well. I draw from emergency management because during emergencies, people's instinct for survival kicks in and you begin to see models that function in different ways that you have never seen before. Mutual aid, refrigerators during COVID, the fact that my neighbors became my best friends, right? Like, so all those things really let us know in the ways in which our body just responds to trauma, like something like COVID, that those are interesting frameworks and models to draw from. I also would say that I draw from anthropology. Like, you have to be invested and want to discover the space in the first place. A lot of what Juan was talking about, right, and the memories of Bogota and growing up, that's the only reason I'm in South Central. People see buildings and I see my childhood, like people see streets and I see memories. And I think having that curiosity and the anthropological framework is important. And then I have to echo what Claudia said. Sometimes it's not you, girl, and that's okay. Sometimes you're not the one to put out the idea, and that's fine. And if it thinks it's you need to check your ego. You're not designing for community, you're designing for accolade. And that's different, right? And so, yeah, I'll say that.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll keep it short and sweet. You just have to be there and you have to bring resources, yourself, your time, money, things for people to actually use and to gather with the community. One of the projects that I'm the most proud of in my career was helping an informal public space to get infrastructure to do all the amazing things that they were doing. And what the community was crying is, everyone has come here. They tell us we're amazing. Yeah, a lot of people use the park, but no one has actually put a soccer court, or give us balls. Just let's put some bleachers. Let's have some exercise equipment that we can use. And it's like, damn, right. So just doing that, just putting the resources, just putting yourself, your time, showing up is one of the best ways to create that synergy. And then hopefully you can trigger within the community people and leaders that would take on, and that'll evolve with the public space as well. Like, it'll evolve with time, but unless you put some inputs, it's going to be really hard to just bring anything from thin air.
100%, y'all. Like, I hope everyone. Oh, Claudia, one more thing from you. Yeah.
Yeah, because what Juan was just saying, this is something it just keeps popping in my head over time. And it is, I think somebody mentioned, there's this idea that we are social beings. We love being outside with other people. We are attracted to places where there's activity going. And maybe going back to my own comment about questioning the whole system. It's sort of like, we know how important public spaces can be, and it's where we put the less resources. It's almost like it's more of like what we negotiate out of development, what we negotiate out of other investment, or even sometimes we do, say, infrastructure investment and don't put the money on the public space as such, right? Like, we just, lots of time, our history is just to have a big open space with no programming, with no resources, no actual activity design into it. And I think that this, to me, is sort of like one of those existential questions of like, it is so easy. You get so much out of it. I just don't understand why we as a society haven't really valued it and giving it the resources that it needs, because it has such repercussion, not just in our like well-being, but like everything else. Like, we are better people. We are not violent. Like, it can help you decrease, as Jose Richard was saying, like our own like body response that sometimes is even unconscious, right? And so by designing these places, we're not just like making nice places that people feel a certain way. No, we are designing spaces so that we as a collective, as a society, can operate to be the best versions of ourselves, not just to fight each other and think that there's no resources for everyone, because there are. And so it's I guess that just brought up because it just drives me nuts that the things that can really be transformative, it's where we put our money last. And somehow we have to collectively change that.
Yeah. Yeah. Y'all, so many gems have been dropped. Claudia, thank you for that last comment. Jose, Richard, Juan, thank you so much for your time today. I think if I were to wrap this up in a fine-tuned bow, which is like not anything you could do with this conversation, honestly, but I would say everything starts with community. If you're not community-centric, you're not doing it. And the academic practice or the research practice that we know is not the real actual process of like natural design or something that we organically came into. I want to close out with just like a little quick comment tying to what Jose Richard opened and said, and it was related to like, you know, like this colonial structure we have, and that's what planning is. If we don't acknowledge the fact that planning, as the firms we work for, and even as a practice, like is related to billable hours and capitalism, we're not acknowledging the fact that that tears away from that community-centric aspect. So how can you take away some of those and take some of what our amazing panelists said today and dig deeper into community, because that's what can build these public spaces that are for people in evolution of time and culture and so on. That is my closing statement. Y'all, thank you so much for joining us today. Our panelists were so dope. Please go shout them out, go share like their amazing feedback and advice that they gave today. I want to thank y'all so much for your time. To our audience, thank you so much for your time because you are amazing. And I want to shout out CoSensus's CX team, James, Giovanni, and Kaina. Thank you so much for putting the work together to make sure that we can have people like y'all come and speak about the dope work you are doing. I hope everyone has a great rest of your afternoon. This recording will be available on YouTube in a few days or like a couple of weeks. Definitely follow our panelists on LinkedIn. Thanks, y'all, and have a great one.
Thank you.